Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
At family game night, when my dad laughed and said, "You never did anything impressive anyway," I didn't flinch. I didn't shout or cry or give him the meltdown he'd probably been poking at me for all these years to get. I simply smiled, stood up, and put away the snacks like some invisible housemaid in her own damn childhood home. But that moment, the shrug, the clink of the snack bowls against the ceramic sink, the click of the cupboard door closing, somehow kicked off a night that none of us would walk away from the same. By midnight, my Aunt Linda was on the phone, sobbing, asking me through her tears, "What did you say to him?" And the truth is, I didn't say much. Not to his face. But sometimes silence, if you leave the right kind of silence, is louder than a scream. And I left him the kind that echoes in your head when you're all alone. It started like every other third Saturday of the month since Mom got sick and recovered, our little forced ritual of family unity, as Dad sarcastically called it, where all the grown-up kids came back to the house to pretend we were all still bound by something more than shared DNA and mutual resentment. Jason was already there when I arrived. Of course, he's never late to anything, because that would disrupt his calendar or his sense of self-importance. His wife, Melissa, was already halfway through pouring out gluten-free snacks into a crystal bowl like she was hosting the PDA, and their kids were running around the living room with toy lightsabers, high on juice and sugar, while no one told them to sit their asses down. Dad was holding court from his favorite recliner, that battered old lazy boy that had a permanent indentation shaped like his authority. His voice filled the whole room, even when he wasn't saying anything important, especially then, actually, like some old army general who never quite made it past the battle lines in his head. He was midway through one of his trademark monologues, telling Chelsea, my cousin, who just hit 100,000 followers on some platform I can't remember, the story of the time he talked down a drunk sergeant in Korea, or maybe it was Germany. Every version gets a little different with each telling, like whiskey aging badly in a rusty barrel. Mom flitted in and out, offering cheese cubes, adjusting the thermostat, asking who wanted decaf, desperate to keep the peace by staying useful. That's always been her job. She thinks she's a bridge between people, but mostly she's a bandage, fragile and temporary. I took a seat near the corner, same place I always sit, just close enough to pretend I'm part of things, just far enough not to get in anyone's way. They didn't notice I'd arrived until about 15 minutes in. "Ratch, hey," Jason called out, barely glancing up from his phone. "Still working at that copywriting thing?" "It's content strategy, but yeah," I answered, knowing damn well no one cared. They never did. That's the thing about game nights in our house. Everyone shows up, but no one really sees each other. We laugh, we argue about rules, we bring snacks, we trade insults dressed up as jokes. But under it all is this tight, bitter silence, like a pressure cooker that no one dares to touch. You learn early on to keep your head down, to be the one who makes things easier, not louder. We were halfway through a chaotic game of Uno, the kind where rules only apply when they benefit the loudest voice in the room, and Chelsea had just played a draw 4 on me, smiling like she'd won something important. I picked up my cards and asked, "So are we playing the house rules again, or the whatever Jason says version?" It got a few chuckles. Even Mom laughed, nervously. But Dad didn't. He stared at me for a second too long, like I'd said something in a different language, and then he leaned back in his chair and let out one of those half-laughs, the kind that sounds more like a dismissal than amusement. "You know," he said, waving a hand in my direction like I was just another detail in the room, "I've always wondered why you take everything so damn personally. Nobody's attacking you. It's just a game. That's your problem, Rachel. You never learn to let things go. Never did anything impressive anyway, so I guess maybe you need the wins wherever you can get 'em." Now, I want to be clear, I've heard worse from him. I've heard sharper, louder. But something about the way he said it, the offhand finality of it, like it was some universal truth he'd just remembered to share, hit differently. Not because it hurt, although maybe it did, but because in that moment, I realized he actually believed it. After everything, after all these years of me biting my tongue, showing up, folding laundry when Mom was recovering from chemo, babysitting Jason's kids for free, making sure Chelsea didn't drive drunk that one Thanksgiving. None of it registered. I was still the placeholder, the extra, the silent one, the nothing. So I stood up. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just calmly. I picked up the bowls of chips and pretzels from the table, walked into the kitchen, and started putting things away like someone who just remembered she had somewhere else to be. I could hear Chelsea giggling at something Jason said, and Mom asking if someone wanted pumpkin pie, and Dad grumbling about how people these days couldn't take a joke. But I wasn't listening. I was in the kitchen, staring at the drawer under the junk drawer, you know the one, the drawer that only long-term families have, the one that holds memories no one wants to keep, but no one's quite ready to throw away. It creaked open, just like it did when I was 10 and hiding in there with a flashlight, reading in secret because Dad said the light bill was too high. And inside, beneath a stack of faded takeout menus and bent bottle openers, was a folded envelope. Not a letter, not yet, but an envelope I remembered hiding there nearly 20 years ago. I hadn't thought of it in ages. I didn't even remember what it held, only that it was mine, and that I'd put it there in the middle of one of those nights when I'd finally had enough of being treated like the family's goddamn doormat. And just like that, the wheels started turning. I didn't yell. I didn't explain. I just wiped my hands on a dish towel, tucked the envelope under my sweater, and walked back into the dining room, smiling like nothing was wrong. Because sometimes, if you want someone to feel the hit, you don't punch them in the face. You just hand them the match and let them figure out what's burning. And I already knew exactly where I was going to leave it. There's something disturbingly familiar about keeping quiet when everything in your body is vibrating with the need to speak, something that roots itself deep in your gut and stays there, coiled and waiting, like an animal that never forgets it's been caged. I've been silent for so long, biting back words, curving into myself to fit other people's expectations, playing the role they cast me in without asking, that it started to feel like a second skin, one I wasn't sure I could shed, even if I wanted to. The truth is, when my father said what he said that night at game night, that one careless sentence that summed up a lifetime of dismissal, "You never did anything impressive anyway," it didn't feel like a shock or a betrayal. It felt like the final stamp on a letter that had been written in slow, steady pen strokes for over 3 decades. After I slipped the envelope into my sweater and went back to that noisy living room, I didn't stay long. I made up some excuse about needing to be up early the next day, which, in fairness, wasn't a lie. I just didn't mention that I needed to be up early so I could be alone with my thoughts before they turned into something too sharp to hold. No one protested my departure. Jason barely looked up from his phone. Melissa gave me a half-hearted hug that smelled like hairspray and wine. Chelsea was already taking selfies with the dog. My mom smiled in that tired, apologetic way she always does, the one that says, "I wish I could make it better, but I've spent my whole life keeping him from burning the place down." And my dad? He didn't even turn his head. Driving home in the dark, I thought about that envelope like it was something alive, something hot and pulsing against my ribs. I knew what it was the moment I saw it, though I hadn't remembered it in years. Back then, I had written a letter, not to be sent, not to be read, not even really to be written, but because I had to get the words out of my body before they turned into something worse. I'd been 17, full of a slow-burning rage that had nowhere to go, and I had just been rejected from a summer writing program I had only applied to in secret because I didn't want to hear what I already knew my father would say. He had told me long before that writing was for people who didn't want to work, that it wasn't a real job, that dreaming was a luxury for people who already had money or nothing better to do. "You want to be useful?" he said one night after dinner, when I tried to show him a short story I'd worked on for weeks. "Then learn to fix something. Or cook. Or do something people actually need. Nobody needs your sad little poems." I remember those words so clearly it's like they were tattooed into the back of my eyes. I didn't cry, at least not in front of him. I waited until he'd gone to bed, until the whole house was quiet, and then I sat on the floor of my room and wrote the letter. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't even angry. It was calm, too calm, and it detailed every moment I had felt myself shrink in his presence, every opportunity I'd let pass, because I didn't want to disappoint him or because I knew trying would mean watching him roll his eyes. I wrote about the time he missed my school play because Jason had a baseball game. I wrote about the night I won second place in a regional essay contest, and he said, "Well, that's nice. Maybe next time you'll get first." I wrote about how, when Mom was sick and couldn't walk more than a few steps, I was the one who stayed up all night with her, making sure she had her meds on time, while Jason was too busy and Dad couldn't deal with seeing her like that. And then I wrote about myself, not like I thought I was, but like I wanted to be someone brave enough to say all this to his face. But I never gave him the letter. I folded it carefully, wrote, "Don't open unless you're ready to hear me" on the front, and hid it in that drawer under the junk drawer because even then, even at 17, I was still hoping he'd find it himself and come ask me what it meant. Of course, he never did. That's the thing with men like him, they never go looking for the mess they made. They just act confused when someone else picks it up and throws it back at them. So when I found it again after all these years, part of me was tempted to tear it up, burn it, throw it out the window. What was the point now? I was 38, divorced, childless, living in a one-bedroom apartment with a view of the parking lot, working a job that paid the bills but never sparked anything inside me. He wasn't wrong, not entirely. I hadn't done anything impressive, not in the way he meant. I hadn't climbed any ladders, hadn't gotten any awards, hadn't given him a single thing to brag about at the VFW or during his endless rants about how kids these days don't know what hard work is. But then again, maybe the letter wasn't for him. Maybe it never was. Maybe it was always for me. I got home and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, holding the envelope like it might break if I squeezed too hard. My apartment was quiet in the way only apartments for one can be. No dog, no television humming in the background, no one waiting for me to come home. Just me and my thoughts, and this thing I had written in the rawest moment of my young life. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I remembered every word, every sentence, every deliberate comma. What I did do, though, was pull out a fresh piece of paper and write a new note, short, barely a paragraph. Because while the letter was full of the past, this new note would be a reminder that I hadn't forgotten any of it. That the silence I'd given him all these years wasn't consent. That I had seen it all. That I had carried it. And that now he could carry something too. Then I folded both my past and my present and slipped them into the same envelope. I didn't sign it. I didn't have to. He'd know. Even if he didn't want to admit it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this counted as revenge, or if it was just finally telling the truth. But in the dark, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: certainty. I knew where I was going to put the envelope. I knew when. I knew how. I knew what kind of silence I was about to leave behind. And I knew, more than anything, that I was done asking for someone else to see me. From now on, I'd make them look. The house was louder than usual when I returned, and I don't just mean the raised voices or the clatter of game pieces on the dining room table. I mean the kind of noise that isn't measured in decibels, the kind that presses behind your eyes and fills your chest with something cold and tight, the kind that lets you know, without needing a word spoken, that you don't belong there anymore, or maybe never did. The door creaked in that familiar way when I came back in, as if even it hesitated to let me re-enter that space, and for a moment I stood there in the foyer, still holding my coat even though the air inside was stuffy with leftover pot roast, forced laughter, and years of emotional dust that nobody ever bothered to sweep out. I told myself I had a reason to be there. I had forgotten my purse, or maybe my phone charger, but in truth, I hadn't forgotten a damn thing. I came back for one reason only, to leave something that couldn't be ignored, misplaced, or talked over. It was nearing 9, and the living room had shifted into that semi-chaotic state that always seemed to follow the first couple of drinks and the last sliver of dessert. Chelsea had taken over the conversation entirely by then, droning on about a brand deal with some company that sold collagen powder, or eye cream, whatever it was. She said the word followers at least 7 times in the span of a minute. And Jason was nodding along like he understood the language she was speaking, even though I'm certain he couldn't tell TikTok from a toaster. My father, of course, was deep into another tale, this time something about a general who had once complimented him on his leadership skills, though I noticed the general's name changed from the last time I heard the story. I didn't say anything. I didn't make a show of coming back. I just slipped past them like a ghost who had learned to haunt quietly, unnoticed unless she wanted to be seen. My steps were deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant. I walked through the narrow hallway lined with old photographs, the ones that told a version of our family history that felt as staged and edited as a Christmas card. Jason in his Little League uniform, Chelsea holding a spelling bee trophy, even me, once or twice. Smiling the kind of smile you only give when someone's telling you to do it louder. The den was dark except for the soft amber glow of the desk lamp, the one Dad always left on because he hated walking into a dark room. His desk was exactly how I remembered it, cluttered with outdated receipts, war medals he never wore but polished every spring, framed certificates from places long gone, and a coaster that hadn't held a cup in years. I took a deep breath, not because I was nervous, but because there was something heavy about that room, something that pressed against your lungs and made you question every decision you ever made in the presence of that man. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the envelope, the one with both letters inside, the original and the new, and placed it gently between two binders labeled retirement and VA claims. I didn't hide it exactly, but I didn't leave it out in plain sight either. I wanted him to find it, but I didn't want to hand it to him. I wanted him to stumble upon it when he least expected to, maybe when he was searching for something else, something practical or self-serving, and instead find me, waiting between the lines. I wanted him to read it when no one else was watching, when he couldn't roll his eyes or dismiss it with one of his recycled jokes about sensitivity or snowflakes. I wanted him to sit there in that worn-out leather chair, in the quiet of his fortress, and hear me for once, no interruptions, no audience, just my words and his silence. I lingered for a second, staring at the envelope, not because I doubted what I'd done, but because part of me wanted to memorize the scene, to take in the image of that room, the smell of old tobacco and paper, the sound of nothing pressing in from all sides. It was, in many ways, the place where my voice had been taken from me, slowly and consistently over years of being told to tone it down, don't be so dramatic, just let it go. And now I was reclaiming it, not with a scream or a fight or a cathartic confrontation, but with a small, simple gesture that would speak louder than I ever could. I walked out as quietly as I came in, slipping past the laughter and clinking glasses, my presence barely noted. Mom called out a distracted goodbye from the kitchen, still scraping pie crust from the pan, and I told her, good night, soft and final, not turning back. Outside, the night air was thick with that late autumn chill that smells like damp leaves and something older, something fading. I got in my car, started the engine, and sat for a moment in the dark, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. I didn't feel proud, exactly, or vindicated. What I felt was clarity, a rare, sharp moment of understanding that this wasn't about changing him, or punishing him, or even making him see what he'd done. It was about me choosing, finally, to stop waiting for permission to speak. I didn't need him to understand. I didn't need anyone to validate my pain. What I needed was to release it, to stop carrying around the hope that one day he might look at me and say, I'm sorry. I was wrong. That was around 9. By midnight, my phone rang loud, piercing, shattering the quiet of my apartment like a thrown glass. I recognized the number immediately. Aunt Linda. I hadn't spoken to her in months, maybe longer, but her name on the screen made my stomach flip in a way that told me whatever this was, it wasn't casual. I answered, heart in my throat, and, before I could say hello, she was crying. Not the soft, movie kind of crying, but the kind where your breath comes in hiccups and your voice shakes from your bones. Rachel, she said, barely getting the word out. Rachel, what did you say to him? The question hit like a slap, like she had caught me doing something shameful and couldn't make sense of it. But the truth, the real truth, was that I hadn't said anything to him at all. I hadn't yelled or argued or made a scene. I had simply placed my truth in the only place he might actually see it and walked away. What did you say to him? She repeated, her voice raw, and all I could do was sit there in the dark, listening to her break, and wonder what, exactly, had been in that silence that made a man like my father finally hear me. There is a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but rather swollen, like a storm cloud right before it splits open above your head. And when I answered the phone to Aunt Linda's tear-soaked voice, trembling, confused, somewhere between panic and heartbreak, I immediately understood that whatever had broken inside my father had sent a shockwave far beyond the walls of that over-decorated living room. And while a part of me had anticipated some reaction, some moment where he might finally confront the years of things unspoken and things deliberately ignored, I hadn't expected it to come in the form of my father locking himself in the den, shutting off his phone, and leaving my mother sobbing outside the door, knocking like a woman begging entry into a past that had finally stopped pretending to be a present. Aunt Linda's voice, though choked and disjointed, managed to paint enough of a picture for me to fill in the rest. Apparently, not long after I left, my dad went quiet, not in the usual way, not in the condescending, smug silence he wielded like a weapon when someone disagreed with him, but in a way that unsettled even Jason, who typically wouldn't notice a forest fire unless it threatened his Wi-Fi. According to her, Dad had taken his usual post-game ritual, reorganizing his desk, polishing a coin or medal, whatever helped him convince himself that time was still linear and his control over it intact, and then, somewhere in that process, he found the envelope I had so carefully, so purposefully left behind. Now, I don't know the exact moment he opened it, don't know whether he read it in one painful gulp or if he sat staring at it for minutes, hours even, letting it hover in his hand like a landmine he wasn't sure how to disarm. But what I do know is that by the time Aunt Linda arrived, after my mother, in a fit of desperation, called her only sibling for help, my father was no longer speaking to anyone. He hadn't left the den. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't responded to my mother's attempts to coax him out with decaf and comfort. And Aunt Linda, who had always been the family's reluctant truth-teller, was the only one who knew something about the fault lines running beneath our family's carefully landscaped exterior that none of the rest of us had ever dared dig into. When she showed up at my apartment the next morning, wearing a coat that looked 2 sizes too big and eyes that had clearly been crying longer than the phone call, I wasn't surprised to see her. I was only surprised that it had taken her that long to come. She didn't ask to come in. She simply stood there on my doorstep, holding her purse like a shield, and said, "Rachel." I read it too. The letter. I found it sitting on the desk like he couldn't even bear to throw it away or hide it. Her voice cracked on the last word, and when I stepped aside to let her in, she moved past me like someone walking into a church, not for worship, but for reckoning. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and for a long moment, we didn't speak. I watched her fingers twitch against the rim of her coffee cup, her nails bare and bitten, the way she used to chew them during tense family dinners when she was the only one who ever dared to push back on my dad's version of reality. She'd always been different from him, softer, but sharper, with a kind of wisdom that made you uncomfortable because it didn't let you pretend. And when she finally did speak, it wasn't with sympathy or even confusion, it was with the kind of weighted honesty that made you sit straighter in your seat. "Rachel," she said, her voice hoarse, "you weren't wrong. You weren't harsh. What you wrote, it was honest. And believe me, I've waited a long damn time for someone else in this family to stop pretending." I wanted to ask her what exactly she meant by that, but I didn't have to. She was already unraveling something that had clearly been waiting inside her chest for decades, something that had grown too large to contain any longer. She told me that when my mother got pregnant with me, before there were pink nursery walls and stuffed animals, before there were baby showers and name lists and tension over whether she'd be allowed to go back to work, my father had left. Not just emotionally, not just metaphorically. He had packed a bag and left. For real. For a woman no one in the family talks about. A woman he had apparently been seeing for over a year. A woman, Aunt Linda said, whose name had once appeared on an old postcard she accidentally saw on the mantel, and then never again. She paused then, as if measuring how much of this to reveal, how much truth I could digest without losing the floor beneath me. "He came back about a month before you were born," she said, her voice lower now. "Swore to your mother that he would make things right, that it had just been a mistake. And your mom, well, she took him back. Because she thought a child needed a father, even if he was the kind who ran when things got too heavy. I sat there stunned, not because the story was particularly surprising. I had always felt, deep down, that there was something fundamentally cracked in the foundation of our family, but because it made so much sense. It explained the way my father looked at me, not like I was his daughter, but like I was the ghost of a choice he wished he hadn't made. It explained why he never celebrated my wins, why every good thing I did seemed to irritate him just a little more. Maybe, in his eyes, I had never been his fresh start, I had been the end of something he thought he wanted more. My mouth was dry, but I forced the question out. Why are you telling me this now? Aunt Linda looked at me with eyes that seemed impossibly tired, and said, because you need to know that what you wrote didn't break him. You just peeled off the bandage. He's been broken for a long time. You just finally made him look at it. And then she reached into her purse and pulled out the envelope, the same one I had left in the den, now creased and opened, the paper inside slightly smudged from where fingers or maybe even tears had brushed against the ink. She placed it gently on the table between us, and for a moment I thought she was going to ask me to take it back, to undo what had been done, to try to repair what was clearly unraveling, but instead, she said, "It's not yours anymore. It's his. Let him carry it now." The air in the room felt heavy, dense with years of unspoken things that had finally found their way into daylight. And I realized, then, that the letter had done something I hadn't fully expected. It hadn't just forced my father to confront me, it had cracked open a lie that had been carefully maintained by everyone for decades. A lie about who he was. A lie about what kind of family we were. A lie about what silence protects and what it destroys. Maybe I hadn't wanted revenge after all. Maybe I had only wanted the truth. And now that I had it, I didn't know whether to feel relieved or just profoundly sad. But one thing was certain. Once a lie like that cracks open, it doesn't go back together again. It spreads. It echoes. It haunts. And no one, not even the man who had once believed himself untouchable, could stop it. There's a kind of clarity that comes after you've torn something open that was never meant to be examined too closely, a moment where everything stands still just long enough for you to see it all, the cracks, the splinters, the weight of silence you carried for years without even realizing how much it had pressed into your spine. In the days that followed Aunt Linda's visit and the unraveling of a truth so carefully buried it had almost fossilized, I found myself moving through the world in a strange, detached calm, like I had finally stepped out of a play I never auditioned for, watching the cast stumble through their lines now that the script had been burned. People say truth sets you free, and maybe that's true in theory, but what they don't tell you is that it also leaves you untethered, floating somewhere between relief and grief, because once you've spoken or written or exposed the truth, you can't take it back. And the pieces don't fall back into place, they just scatter. I hadn't planned on going back to the house, not really. I told myself there was nothing left to say, nothing left to retrieve, that I had already delivered everything I needed to, and that whatever came next belonged entirely to them, their reactions, their choices, their attempts to either repair or ignore the rupture. But then my mother called, her voice subdued and distant, telling me that my father wanted to see me. Not that he asked, or demanded, or even insisted, just that he wanted to, in the soft, careful way she always spoke when trying to translate his intentions into something more palatable. I should have said no. I should have let the silence speak for itself. But something about the tone in her voice, something about the way she said Rachel, with more fear than hope, made me agree, if only to close the door properly this time. The drive to the house felt different than it had a few nights before, quieter, slower, as if the road itself understood that I wasn't returning as the same person who had walked out. The air was colder, too, with that brittle edge autumn gets right before it gives up and lets winter take over, and when I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the porch light was already on, flickering slightly like it had done for years. The same dull yellow glow that had once made the house feel safe, now barely holding back the dark. My mother opened the door, and for a moment we just looked at each other, both of us knowing there was no version of this that would feel normal. She didn't hug me, didn't smile, just stepped aside, allowing me to pass like someone giving way at a funeral, and I realized then how exhausted she looked, like something inside her had shifted too. We didn't speak as I made my way down the hall, past the same photographs that now felt even more artificial, every frozen smile a lie layered over the truth that had never been allowed to breathe. He was in the den, of course. Where else would he be? Sitting in that same chair, surrounded by the same clutter, only now the desk was nearly empty, the envelope gone, the medals tucked away. He didn't look up when I entered, just gestured to the chair across from him, and I sat without a word, the air between us thick with all the conversations we never had. For a long time, we didn't speak. He looked older somehow, not just in the lines on his face or the slump of his shoulders, but in the way he held himself, like someone finally aware of their own weight. I could feel him looking at me, but I didn't return the gaze. I focused on a crack in the wall behind him, a small, jagged line that hadn't been there before, or maybe it had, and I just hadn't noticed. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I remembered, like it had lost some of its edge. "I read it," he said, not as an accusation, not as a challenge, but as a simple fact. I nodded, waiting, refusing to fill the silence just because it felt uncomfortable. He cleared his throat, like he was trying to dislodge something stuck deep inside, and then said, "Some of it. I don't remember it that way. Some of it I do. Maybe more than I want to admit." He paused again, and I let the silence stretch. I wasn't there to comfort him. I wasn't there to make it easier. "I don't know what you want from me," he said finally, and there it was, the core of him, laid bare. Not anger, not defiance, but confusion, the kind that comes from someone who genuinely believed that ignoring a wound would keep it from festering. "I don't want anything," I said, my voice calm, steady. "I just wanted you to know that I remember it. That I carried it. And now you get to carry it, too." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time in my life I saw something behind those eyes that wasn't judgment or control, it was uncertainty, maybe even fear. And while part of me longed to dig deeper, to ask why, to demand more, I knew it wasn't worth it. The man across from me wasn't the one I'd been battling all my life. That man existed only in memory, in shadow, in my teenage scribbles and quiet disappointments. The man sitting in front of me was just old. And tired. I stood up, pulled a second envelope from my bag, this one blank, unsealed, containing nothing, and placed it on the desk. He furrowed his brow, reaching for it with hesitant fingers, and I said, "You can decide what's in this one. You get to imagine it. That's what you're good at, right?" His lips parted like he might respond, but no sound came. I didn't wait. I turned and walked out, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet in a rhythm that felt familiar, but no longer heavy. I passed my mother in the hallway. She didn't speak either, only looked at me with that same expression she wore the night I stayed up with her after chemo, when neither of us had the strength to lie. Outside, the air hit like a slap, sharp, clean, final, and as I stepped into my car and shut the door behind me, I felt something loosen inside me, something that had been knotted for far too long. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just drove, letting the night swallow the road behind me. Some say I was cruel, that I went too far, that a daughter should never humiliate her father, no matter the history. Others say I was brave, finally taking a stand, speaking for every overlooked girl who grew up in the shadow of a man who never really saw her. But for me, it wasn't about revenge or closure or even justice. It was about refusing to remain silent just because it made things easier for everyone else. It was about letting the echo of my voice exist in a space where it had always been erased. The family hasn't been the same since. Jason hasn't called. Mom texts short sentences, always about the weather or her cholesterol. Aunt Linda checks in sometimes, but mostly we don't speak of it. As for my father, I don't know. Maybe he still has the envelope. Maybe he opens it sometimes, hoping to find something inside. But it's empty. That's the point. Because what I didn't say, said everything.